Hey everybody, welcome back to our weekly podcast. You may have noticed we took a little bit of a break, but we're back. If you're a fan of the show, you'll notice
Just
that.
release them on whatever.
My name is Patrick Tan, General Counsel for ChatArgos. With me as usual, our CEO, Chief Data Scientist, Jonathan Reiter. Thanks for tuning in. And this week, it's no data week, but we've got a bit of commentary on what's been going on in the markets and industry over the past couple of weeks since we've been on the air. We're going to talk about the new market structure bill. John's going to explain what that is to us. Custodia's VBit. An interesting approach to a few issues. Tornado Cash's charges have been dropped.
Charge.
Yeah, some of the charges. And I think the ones that have been dropped are sensible, to be honest. And then Coinbase Hack. So it's not like they stole a bunch of crypto, but the different kind of hack.
I don't think their hack's the right word.
Yeah, I feel like it was, but I think that's the generic term that they use these days for everything, every kind of exploit.
Hack, but they bribe anyway.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, when you
It's
bribe
a
a
life
guy,
hack, I guess. It's in
when you bribe a guy and he gives you the keys, that's not really
That's a life hack.
Yeah, that's And then finally, Ripple's dismissal rejection, which was interesting. We'll comment that towards the end. So it's quite a bit of stuff to unpack. Let's just go straight into the new market structure bill.
It's all sort of legal bits because some of the reason there's no data is we've spent a lot of time dealing with questions on legal related stuff now.
Correct.
Yeah, so this is another new market structure, whatever proposal in the U.S. Specifically, so this is about how you're going to separate out products that, for decentralization related reasons, don't fit, supposedly, purportedly don't fit within traditional securities regulation type regimes, but where it's known that they don't fit completely under commodity regimes because, there's no disclosures for iron ore, it's just iron ore. Right. So the company that's digging it out of the ground may disclose how much they've dug out of the ground, but the iron ore itself is just iron ore. Right. The disclosure is a very short form with the chemical formula, and I guess the percentage iron ore,
Yeah,
whatever,
purity and
dirt,
stuff like that.
Yeah. That's gold has a purity and
Specific gravity, if you will.
Yeah. Okay. So the part that's interesting here is that the market structure bill has kind of specific reduced requirements around all kinds of things for what are known as mature blockchain systems. And it's interesting, and I'm going to say at the beginning here, this is kind of, to software engineers, this process is going to sound totally absurd, right? And I think it demonstrates that a lot of the people who are writing these rules are either lawyers who you would expect aren't software engineers,
There you go.
or
Guilty
the
as charged.
extent to which they're getting feedback from people in the software space, they may not be very experienced with developing software. So the requirements for a mature blockchain system, this is the term in the bill, right, and I'm paraphrasing some of this, are that there's no common control and that there's no unilateral authority to censor transactions, okay? That they are 100% automated and, quote, do not involve necessary reliance on any person, okay? And that the development is, quote, substantially completed. And it's that point in particular that I think is very interesting. Anyone that's worked with software for a long period of time, Linux is a widely used operating system, it's open source, whatever, and the guy, original developer and still head of whatever, Linux development, Linus Torvalds, has repeatedly said, as far as he's concerned, development was substantially completed by the mid-90s because it had everything he needed. Software being substantially completed is fascinating. Anyone with a phone, or you're not going to get experienced software people to say a piece of software is substantially completed.
What the hell does that mean anyway?
Yeah. Now, you can say that the functionality in the system is kind of everything that we wanted.
Would you say the Sagrada Familia is substantially completed?
Yeah, I mean, well, okay, that's somewhat separate. But yeah, like the end of installing air conditioning at toilets or whatever. I mean, that physical construction he's talking about, long-term cathedral construction in Europe. So that's kind of an interesting concept. Okay, so whatever. I'm not sure that you have software that's substantially completed. Maybe, immutable smart contracts are done when they're published, right? But the extent to which there's anything around those contracts, it's not ever substantially completed.
I guess it depends on what you define as software. If you limit the definition of the software just to the smart contract, which is strange because that's not what Well,
Well,
but you could.
every immutable smart contract qualifies, but none of the stuff around it does.
Yeah.
The web front end is never substantially completed because you're constantly having to rebuild the page as web technology changes, because Chrome won't reasonably render web pages from 10 years ago.
Correct. So does that mean?
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting. Now, there is a mechanism for it. So what you do is you say that your project is a mature blockchain system, and then you get these exemptions. There is kind of a presumption built into the rule that people who claim this are correct. So there's a public comment period, and there's a way that the government can decide to challenge these claims, but it's much weaker than the way the SEC is with registration statements at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Approximately, the way the registration statements for securities issuance work is the SEC gets to keep telling you to make changes. The letters are public. So I'll say most, not 100%, but most of the back and forth with the regulator about the completeness of your disclosure statements is public information. And people complain sometimes it's too painful and not too painful. Here, they're essentially saying there's a presumption that it's correct. There's a public comment period, and it's quite hard for the government to say that your claims aren't true. Even setting aside history of misrepresentations around decentralization, evaluating if a piece of software is substantially completed or has a vector of common control is way outside the competence of a securities regulator, because they're not software. So I don't know what the intention is here. If somebody wants to provide the relevant regulator with the budget and staffing for consultants to evaluate software, I don't even know how you do that. You can have a conversation about this, but
also, what would the legal standard be? Because
there's no legal standards for any of this stuff.
Well, I mean, like, if I were an attorney, I would argue this thing to court till the second coming of Christ.
It's interesting. So you don't have any standing to do that.
Yeah.
So you don't have an opportunity to do that. I think the most that you could do here is see a project that you thought was saying things that weren't accurate and submit a public comment. You've no standing to take any legal action to block what would be, in traditional terms, the effectiveness of the registration statement. That's just kind of weird, right? And I would add that the extent to which the government is going to rely on commentary from other parties, or even commentary from itself, getting people to do these evaluations, the dynamic is awful, right? Because, importantly, right, for projects that have a hidden or somewhat obfuscated vector of centralization, it's much more profitable, better, from the perspective of someone who understands that, to just break the product than it is to participate in that process. Because in advance of a collapse, calling out such a product as breakable and fake decentralized just generates a bunch of pushback and hate, and doesn't generate any money. Breaking it will, and you make yourself a target by calling it out in advance. Whereas silently shooting it in the head and collecting the money doesn't attract hate. So the dynamics here don't favor people assisting the government. In the case of a lot of securities, whatever stuff relies on whistleblower things and those kinds of requirements. This is all well known in lots of countries. Because they're public securities, right, and they're companies that are centralized and operated by people, you can't work out that this is a fraud, go in, break the factory, and force the price to go to zero. Whereas with a lot of these products, you can. So there's a big difference in that people assisting the government, shorting the stock, such as it is, to investigate and root out fraud, that works as a dynamic because there is no direct mechanism. There's no way to cause the catalyst to make the thing reveal that the statements are fraudulent. In many of these cases, there is a catalyst that can be affected by someone who observes that. So the dynamics are completely different. And, people who understand this in general, whatever, have zero incentive to assist the government or ever talk about it publicly. They have a much better incentive to just quietly break it and keep the money. And that's not...
That's not advice.
No, that's a statement about how the incentives are not aligned here.
Well,
right?
because when you don't
incentives are not aligned with the regulator.
What the issues are, it's easy for this thing to not.
Yeah.
I
mean, you made a comment about it as a lawyer challenging it, but of course the whole point is if you don't have to go to court, you can just bankrupt the company, effectively short the stock and bankrupt the company yourself. you would just do that.
Which in normal circumstances,
You can't
is against the law.
company's run by the company's run by people, so you have to wait them out.
Yeah.
Whereas here you can just publish the zero treasury or force the contract to default on its you enter a debt spiral such as it is, right? There's lots that you can do. So I think there's a problem with the structure, independent even of it being hard to evaluate if software is substantially completed, but that the incentive alignment between knowledgeable investors and the law enforcement, regulator, government in general, they're very opposed here, right? So whistleblower programs are a way of aligning incentives between, and just generally, shorting stock and talking to journalists, are ways of aligning the incentives of people who do investment research and the government, which has an interest in the laws being enforced correctly, whatever. And here there really isn't one of those, because when things can be shut off and zeroed, because of the automated nature, right? So the fact that it's 100% automated and does not necessarily involve the reliance on any person, oftentimes that means there is a reliance on something that you may or may not be able to exert outsized control over, right? So it may be automated, but not, think of the way Terra Luna exploded, right? The whole point there was that one piece of the system relied on a guy, but another piece of the system was completely automated. And when that guy ran out of money, the other automated piece kept running. And that is not the way private companies operate. So exploiting that dynamic is very different here and can be very bad. The incentive alignment is bad.
Well, maybe they'll fix it in post.
Well, because you won't know who broke the thing, you won't be, and they didn't do anything wrong, so they just get to keep their money.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's some interesting issues with the regulatory structure, the incentive alignment.
Tell me about this Custodia VBit stuff.
Yes, okay, so Custodia Bank, this is getting a long thing for a long time. So, we've now got 4 sort of legal commentary things that are a bit shorter, just to clear the decks on some of this in a legal week. So Custodia has put together a product that is essentially it's a tokenized bank deposit. So it's a bearer share entitling you to the contents of a bank account. And that's pretty much what the documentation says, right? Forget mechanically how this thing works. Permissionless, whatever, stablecoin. I don't understand how... so fair enough. Having bank accounts with unknown UBOs is definitely a thing that we have experience with. I am surprised that someone wants to talk so publicly about doing so much of that, just because it's a bit on the nose, right? So if Wyoming, which does have bans on bearer shares and a lot of the West wants to do that, they're obviously entitled to do that. I do think they'll struggle to get various kinds of federal whatever charters. I don't know. I don't know. I guess we're going to try and see if that works now. But providing a facility that overtly offers bank accounts with unknown UBOs is surprising to me. And as we talked about previously, these are also, because they're interest-bearing and they're investment vehicles, right? So you have bank run risk and all the rest of this with investment vehicles. Don't exist with payment vehicles. So it's an interesting experiment. It's just so on the nose.
It's like a throwback to the good old days of number of bank accounts, unknown UBOs, the usual stuff.
Yeah, because people
It's not
say
like it didn't exist in the
cash, whatever. Things that are payment instruments are also quite different, because payment instruments don't really require liquidity solvency. Like the payment company has to have the money, but you don't withdraw your money from PayPal. It's not how you use PayPal.
Yeah.
Right? The velocity is very high, but the balance that sits there is quite low. Whereas things that are savings vehicles accumulate larger amounts of value and are subject to all kinds of dynamics that are just different. I'm surprised. That's all.
Coinbase Hack.
You do Tornado Cash next or Coinbase?
We'll do Coinbase Hack.
Okay, so I don't.
I don't like the term hack.
A bunch of Coinbase employees were bribed to provide some customer information. Apparently, it's like 1% of all customers, which is a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a lot of people.
It's not a hack. I mean, it's a crime. Well, is it a crime? So
it's not ideal.
I'm assuming that the people who accepted money to provide access to the Coinbase system were a contractor or employee of Coinbase that had some kind of responsibility to keep the information to themselves. I don't actually know that that's the case. Because, it is conceivable that a company hires consultants without strong confidentiality agreements and provides those consultants with access to information about their clients and doesn't require them to promise. No, but you could see how, we'll make this up, right? But you could be some company in North America, Western Europe. You could set up a call center in the Philippines.
You know how this would work?
You could hire them as consultants, and you could not have the contract with those consultants to
Correct.
require them to keep any information confidential.
Because-
And actually, that means no law's been violated, except
Correct,
maybe
correct.
the failure
So
of the
the
company
way
to follow the U.S. law.
the way this usually works is that, let's say you want to outsource a call center or something, a customer service front, people to answer the phone basically. You don't usually. It's not typical where the large company goes direct. Usually what happens is you sort of like outsource to another service provider. There's like another service provider.
Yeah.
And then they usually combine an amalgamation of a couple of cells that they take care of for you. And there's no, usually the agreements aren't with the end.
Well, yes, there's two components here. One of them is you'd have agreements about confidentiality
Yeah.
that may or may not have existed here. We're just saying there are plausible ways in which no crime was committed by anyone but the Coinbase company, that the employees actually didn't commit a crime, right? Because if I'm a consultant and I have information from my clients and I've never promised my clients to give that information to myself, I can sell that information to other clients. I mean, the core business of a lot of large consulting firms is effectively doing that on an anonymized basis, right? So the whole point of PwC, KPMG is you talk to 100 companies, you learn about them. You don't sell the trade secrets of one to other people, but you sell the lessons learned overall. That's fine. But without a confidentiality agreement. The second issue, right? So the first component is the contract you're talking about. The second component is that you design the system such that the people do not structurally have access, right? So this shouldn't have been able to happen. And at most, I think everywhere I've ever worked, financial services, whatever, this simply could not have happened.
You wouldn't have had access to
Months of now it took them several months to exfiltrate that much information.
Sure.
So there might have been some kind of rate limiting, but the number of people in the period of time, because this started in January. If you have a customer service agent that's pulling the full details of 100 people a day for 3 months, like the system will have shut it off before then. So I don't know. Hopefully there's an interesting investigation. There's a world in which the employees didn't actually do anything wrong because they didn't violate any confidentiality promises. And, I mean, clearly, if Coinbase was required under U.S. or EU or whatever, and we don't know what customers' information was leaked, so it could be a GDPR problem, who knows. That they definitely, some part of the company definitely violated privacy laws in North America, Western Europe, somewhere, right? Almost certainly. I mean, if all 1% of those customers had addresses in the Seychelles and they don't have privacy laws, I don't know. Maybe nobody broke any laws. I mean, I don't know. Right? We need more information.
we don't have all.
But it's interesting. It's a situation where it's actually nothing to do with crypto at all, except that Coinbase's procedures appear to have been materially worse than banks and insurance companies from many, many years ago. I mean, when you have hacks, actual hacks at companies and information leaks, that's one thing. Because if you hack, in the traditional sense, you break into a system that you have access to. The information exists somewhere, so you decrypt it or break the password, whatever. But this was just employees that had in-system access. These people weren't hackers. So there's no software problem. If I'm a customer service agent and I need to see whatever data the customer service agent system allows me to see, right? It may or may not be the employee's fault, but it's also the company's fault. If the company gets hacked, it's harder to say it's the company's fault. It depends what happened. But providing them with your own systems with that kind of access is just catastrophically bad. I see that they're already being sued by a bunch of people for all kinds of violations, which is not surprising to me. One of them was about biometric information harvesting, whatever. But they're going to get sued because
that's what happens.
Western business with a bunch of aggrieved customers.
Tornado Cash charge was dropped. Which one?
Okay, yeah. So they dropped the money transmission charges.
Okay, fair enough.
And again, I think we've been very good at predicting this one. So we had said from the very beginning that a lot of the conspiracy and that sort of stuff, the money laundering, obfuscation of flows, they seem pretty clearly guilty of. And the money transmission stuff they appear to have done, but for a different period of time than the government charged them with. So my preference still would have been for the government to amend the charges to include the correct, or to be for the correct period. But I guess the second best thing is to remove the charge that the period doesn't apply to. But they're keeping the charges that it clearly applies to. So the Kyber swap we talked about a couple weeks ago, you have another situation where some of the charges, very clearly the person did assuming the transcripts in the filings aren't made up.
I think what was
but
it?
some of the other
Something about,
charges just don't seem quite right. Yeah,
the machine thing.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a couple of different. So
attacking a computer. Or
I
something.
mean, we don't. Oh, the damage to a protected
computer.
So it's another in a long pattern here where some of what's charged seems to be unquestionably a thing that happened and that they're guilty of. Some of which charged seems to be something that they maybe couldn't have done, or the time period's wrong, the details just don't match correctly. So they're slowly getting around to charging the right stuff. I don't know if it's normal for people to be charged with a batch of crimes, because when you get charged with a crime, you actually get charged with a bunch of very specific things.
Correct.
And maybe it's normal for some of those to be just adjacent to the truth and not. I don't know. We're not white-collar criminal defense lawyers.
Thank God for them.
It is what it is. But it's interesting. So I think the government has, if anything, strengthened their case at trial by removing charges for which I would argue they're sort of guilty if you make some minor edits to the document, changing some dates, but not even having to have that conversation simplifies the other stuff. Similarly to the Kyber swap one, by bringing in charges that the guy didn't do, you're making it easier to confuse people because it's confusing. So maybe this is standard trial strategy. Charge the person with 14 things, drop 7 of them. And to me, that feels wrong.
But that's kind of the system.
I think you're not supposed to charge people with things you don't think you can prove. And if the answer is that the government sort of rounds up or doesn't really understand how some of these things work and is coming around to learning and editing their files as a result, that's great. As we're going to come to in 1 second, courts are also coming around to making the government explain ways in which it may have done stuff wrong or right historically. And I think that this, we'll talk, the Ripple dismissal rejection right now is, I think, the first in what will be a long series of cases where courts say, all right, so the first thing you need to do is to admit that, what is it? You can't, it's absolution. We've talked about this before, where you pay somebody back, yet making restitution requires admitting that you committed the theft. Yeah. So Ripple, the SEC and Ripple have a very long-running dispute that goes back, I think, to the 1970s.
Making amends.
Right? Something like that.
7-9, I think.
And recently, under the new SEC whatever setup, the SEC and Ripple agreed to massively cut a previously agreed fine and cut out large portions of other stuff that was required to be done by Ripple and the rest of it. And both parties. So the government secured a deal. There was a trial. There was a judgment, whatever, a bunch of money. And, judgment entered. And then later the government and the defendant came back and have said, we've made a different deal where we pay a lot less money and have far fewer restrictions on us. And the judge has said no. So this was portrayed in some of the press as just a procedural thing. I don't think that's quite right. So the judge said that the procedure that was followed wasn't correct, but the procedure they should have followed requires the government to present evidence of, quote, exceptional circumstances to modify an entered, settled, whatever judgment. And that feels like as it should be, right? Because the legal system is about finality, and you achieve finality, and overturning that requires more than just what you fought about the first time. Otherwise, you fight at the same level of intensity forever. So they're going to need to come back and explain the exceptional circumstances. If the answer is simply the SEC has changed its policy, is there case law on whether or not that counts as an exceptional circumstance? It doesn't sound exceptional to me. Policy changes every time the president changes. Maybe more frequently than that.
Policy is probably not the right term to use.
Policy priorities, enforcement strategy.
Enforcement priorities is probably one of the things.
That can't be exceptional because the enforcement priorities change at least as frequently as the chairperson.
The issue, though, is that usually, let's say now, new president, new administration, you try to settle, maybe new SEC, new everything. You try to settle the stuff that it's no longer an enforcement priority. Try to settle as much as you can.
But this was already reached judgment.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
That's the problem. That's the issue with this case. If it were still in the process of being tried, you could take it off the rails. if it hadn't.
Well, they'd still have to ask the judge for permission
Correct.
to withdraw, but the bar would be lower.
Very low,
Well,
because
I'm not sure about if the trial starts. I'm not sure how low, but lower.
no, much lower. Like, you know,
It's not exceptional circumstances.
Yeah, you don't need exceptional circumstances is a pretty high bar. Like, why are we, you know, kind of essentially giving this guy a get out of jail free card, or like, you know?
It was a monetary fine agreed that they've cut by, I think, 2/3.
And you have to explain, because it's not like this wasn't already agreed.
Multi-year litigation in it.
Yeah. So I think that's really just the court doing its job.
Yeah. In the Tornado Cash case, the government can say, we are no longer as confident as regards this portion, whatever. Or they can say, we are 100% confident on 5 of the 7 things. 2 of these have political whatever, and actually the sentence will be the same in all cases moving on. And, you know,
that's okay.
You know, you have to get consent to withdraw charges. That should be fine. Yeah, here really is different, and it's not clear what will be required. I assume, well, actually, I don't know. The government can't force the judge to accept a removal of a settled judgment, so I don't know how much power they have to. I mean, the SEC could just say, we're not going to bother to collect the money from you, and then the judge would just sit out there forever.
Yeah.
But that would mean that the next administration or whatever could just ask for the money. So
at some point,
I don't know how that works.
See, once you get a judgment, it's up to you to enforce it, and that's the whole business.
Well, the government's enforcement mechanisms are
for
strong.
government enforcement, it's different, because they, you know,
The U.S. government can enforce against the U.S. company fairly easily.
Yeah. So that's interesting, and we'll see.
Yes, we'll see. The government will have to make some kind of statement about how their policy position with respect to this case has changed, and then the court is going to say something amounting to, fine, that happens all the time, because it's in a democracy, elections, people change, whatever, but it doesn't mean that you go back and undo judgments from 1973. Otherwise, there's never finality in anything. What are you doing here? Because you can't increase what happened. You know, it can't increase the severity. So that means that every company can simply continue to pay lobbyists to ask the government to reduce things long after the judgments have been entered. And I don't think anyone, except maybe for those lobbyists, has an interest in that being the way that the system works, because that's ridiculous. There has to be an end to these things. So this is a wonderful case, I think, in which we discussed, or many people discussed, I don't know if we had this on the podcast, but at the time, you know, should Ripple and other companies settle now, or should they take their chances going forward? And in this case, it looks as though Ripple concluded that they settled too early, and they should have punted on longer, because if the Trump-era SEC is trying to reduce the judgment, then they actually presumably would have simply canceled the case outright. They can't go to the judge now and say, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, they did the best they could with the information they had.
These are gambles, right? That's okay. But it's so there's a lot of evolving legal stuff that's quite interesting to see how it will go. But the tide appears to be turning towards the government hasn't completely understood what it's doing and needs to explain itself a bit better, which is fine. I mean, people learn, live and learn.
And on that note, thanks for tuning in. And thanks for watching. We appreciate all those likes, comments, and subscribes. Algorithm appreciates it, and we appreciate it, so we can get that content out to other people. Thank you. And we will
I thought you were going to explain about that.
Oh, yeah, sure. So this is a scene in Singapore. This is actually a famous shop house. It's one of the circulars. Both of them are shop houses. You can see these kind of shop houses in near the city center and stuff like that. It's a piece of heritage out of Singapore. These are like watercolor paintings.
Yeah, that's all. This is in the middle of what used to be the red light district.
Yeah, this is actually not far from our office. So there you go. And on that note, we'll see you again soon. Thank you.